My mother-in-law tried to rehome my newborn to my infertile sister-in-law 2 weeks after my husband's funeral. Now they're both blocked. She said it 2 weeks after the funeral while I was nursing Olivia in what used to be our bedroom. You're young. You can have more children. Rachel's 41. This is her last chance. I stared at her standing in my doorway holding a casserole. What did you just say? I'm being practical. You're 28, working part-time, no family nearby. Rachel and Todd have money, a big house, stability. They've tried for 15 years. You want me to give away my daughter? Not give away, share. Like an adoption, but keeping it in the family. Get out. Think about what Brian would want. Brian. My husband who died in a motorcycle accident 6 weeks after Olivia was born. Brian would want his daughter with her mother, I said. Brian would want what's best for Olivia. A 2-parent household with resources. Leave. Now. She set the casserole on my dresser. Rachel's waiting downstairs. She'd like to discuss this rationally. Rachel's here? I put Olivia in her crib and went downstairs. Rachel was sitting on my couch sorting through Brian's things. These photos from your wedding are nice. You were so young. I was 24. Still, so unprepared for all this. A baby, no husband, those medical bills. What medical bills? Janet came down behind me. From Brian's accident. The insurance didn't cover everything. Yes, it did. I have the statements. Rachel exchanged a look with her mother. There might be complications. Appeals. These things drag on. Unless you have support. Is that a threat? It's reality, Janet said. Fighting insurance companies takes lawyers, money you don't have. But Rachel does. We want to help, but you have to be reasonable. Rachel walked over to Olivia's swing. She's beautiful. Looks just like Brian as a baby. Don't touch her things. I'm just looking. Todd and I have the nursery ready. Been ready for years. Yellow walls, elephant theme I picked during our first IVF. That doesn't entitle you to my baby. Your baby who'll grow up without a father. Watching other kids with dads at school plays, father-daughter dances. Stop. Can you really give her everything she needs, alone, while grieving? Millions of single mothers do it. But why should you have to? Janet asked. When there's a perfect solution. Rachel raises Olivia, you stay the devoted aunt. Everyone wins. I lose my daughter. You keep her. She just lives somewhere better suited for her needs. With Rachel. With family who can provide properly, Rachel said. Private schools, college funds, opportunities you'll never afford on a teacher's aide salary. I don't care about private schools. Brian would have. Don't tell me what my husband wanted. Rachel pulled out her phone, showed me texts. These are from Brian. 3 months ago. He was worried about providing for Olivia, asked if Todd and I would be guardians if something happened. My hands shook. He never told me that. He didn't want to upset you. Being guardians if we both died isn't the same as taking her while I'm alive. But it shows he trusted us. Janet sat beside me. No one's saying you're a bad mother. But you're grieving. Maybe a temporary arrangement? Rachel keeps Olivia while you get back on your feet? Temporary? Rachel's face lit up. Like shared custody? No. Like you taking my baby and never giving her back. That's not what we're suggesting, Janet said. You show up here, threaten me with fake bills, and expect me to hand over my infant? We're trying to help, Rachel said. You're trying to steal my baby using grief against me. Steal is harsh, Janet said. What would you call it? I stood up. Both of you leave. Don't come back. Rachel's face hardened. You're being selfish. I've lost 4 babies. You have no idea what that's like. You're right, but that doesn't mean you get mine. I would be a better mother. I've prepared longer, wanted it more. Wanting something doesn't make it yours. Janet gasped. How cruel. Rachel's pain is real. So is mine. I buried my husband 2 weeks ago. I wake up thinking I hear his voice. You think I'm not in pain? Technically, Rachel said slowly, grandparents have rights. Mom could petition for custody given your situation. You wouldn't. Janet lifted her chin. If it's best for Olivia, we would. We hoped it wouldn't come to that, Rachel said. But if you force our hand, she's my baby, not some consolation prize for your infertility. Rachel started crying. How can you be so hateful? How can you be so entitled? Janet stood. We'll give you time to reconsider. Think about Olivia's future. They left. I called my lawyer friend that night, documented everything. 3 days later, I got a letter from Rachel's lawyer about grandparent visitation rights. I called Kira that night after putting Olivia down. She answered on the second ring and listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she told me to come to her office at 9 the next morning and bring all my documentation. She said her father Harvey specialized in family law and would sit in on the meeting. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face when she said she'd be a better mother. At 8:30, I bundled Olivia into her car seat and drove to Kira's office downtown. My hands shook the whole way there. Kira met me in the lobby and took Olivia while I gathered my folder of printed emails, text screenshots, and notes from the confrontation. Her father was already in the conference room reviewing the letter from Rachel's lawyer. Harvey was maybe 60 with gray hair and reading glasses. He stood up when we came in and shook my hand. His grip was firm and steady. Kira set up Olivia's portable bassinet in the corner while Harvey read through everything I'd brought. He took his time, making notes on a yellow legal pad. After 20 minutes, he looked up and asked me to walk him through the timeline starting from Brian's death. I told him about the funeral, the 2 weeks after, Janet and Rachel showing up at my house. He stopped me when I got to the part about the texts Rachel showed me. He asked if I'd seen the actual messages or just Rachel's phone screen. Just her screen, I said. He made another note. Then he asked about Brian's relationship with his sister. I explained they were close but not super tight. Brian loved Rachel but found her baby obsession hard to deal with sometimes. He'd mentioned it twice during my pregnancy, how Rachel kept asking weird questions about our birth plan, and who would watch Olivia if we needed help. Harvey nodded and wrote more notes. When I finished the whole story, he sat back and looked at me directly. He said grandparent rights cases were hard to win in our state, especially when the surviving parent was clearly fit and involved. But he warned me that Janet and Rachel would make this expensive and exhausting even if they knew they'd probably lose. They were using the legal system to pressure me into giving up. He said that was their real strategy. Make it so costly and draining that I'd agree to visitation or shared custody just to make it stop. I felt sick hearing that. Harvey saw my face and told me not to panic yet. He said we had advantages they didn't expect. I was young, employed, had a clean home, and a thriving baby. Their case was built on manipulation and desperation, not facts. Then he explained something that made me want to cry with relief. Those texts Rachel showed me about guardianship were taken completely out of context. Brian was discussing backup plans if we both died, not expressing any doubt about my parenting. Harvey said that was a normal conversation for new parents to have, and it meant nothing about custody while I was alive and well. Rachel had twisted a responsible discussion into evidence of Brian's supposed concerns. Harvey told me we needed to get ahead of this by documenting my fitness as a mother and Olivia's development. Medical records, pediatrician statements, proof of a stable home environment. He wanted everything in writing before Rachel's lawyer could build a narrative about me being unstable or overwhelmed. I asked what I needed to do first. He said call Olivia's pediatrician right away and schedule an appointment specifically to document her health and growth. Explain the situation and ask for a detailed letter confirming she was well cared for and hitting all her milestones. I pulled out my phone and called from the conference room. The receptionist put me through to the nurse when I said it was urgent. I explained as calmly as I could that my in-laws were trying to take my baby and I needed documentation for a custody case. The nurse put me on hold and came back 2 minutes later with an appointment slot at 3 that afternoon. She sounded concerned and said the doctor would make time. After I hung up, Harvey outlined his response strategy. He'd send a formal letter to Rachel's lawyer that same day stating I would not voluntarily surrender custody or visitation. Any attempt to pursue grandparent rights would be vigorously contested. He said the letter would be professional, but make absolutely clear I wasn't the easy target they assumed. He'd also request copies of any evidence they planned to present, including the full context of those text messages with Brian. Kira offered to come with me to the pediatrician appointment. I almost cried again. Having someone on my side after weeks of feeling totally alone made my chest tight. We left Harvey's office at 11 and I went home to feed Olivia and try to eat something myself. My stomach was in knots, but I forced down half a sandwich. At 2:30, Kira picked us up and drove to the pediatrician's office. Dr. Klein had been Olivia's doctor since birth. She was maybe 40, calm and thorough. When we got into the exam room, she closed the door and asked me to explain what was happening. I told her everything while she examined Olivia. She weighed her, measured her length and head size, checked her reflexes and muscle tone. Olivia was perfect, hitting every milestone, gaining weight appropriately, no concerns at all. When the exam finished, Dr. Klein sat down and looked at me with something like anger in her eyes. She said she was horrified that anyone would use a custody threat against a grieving mother with a healthy baby. She'd write a detailed letter documenting Olivia's excellent care and development. She also offered to testify if it came to that. I thanked her about 5 times. She printed out growth charts and immunization records for Harvey and made copies of everything in Olivia's file. By the time we left, I had a folder of medical documentation proving I was doing everything right. That night, I emailed everything to Harvey. He responded within an hour saying he'd draft his response letter first thing in the morning. 2 days later, Janet started calling. The first call came at 1 in the afternoon while I was changing Olivia's diaper. I saw Janet's name on the screen and didn't answer. She called back 5 minutes later. Then again, 10 minutes after that. By 4 o'clock, she'd called 17 times. I didn't pick up once, but she left voicemails. I listened to them that evening after Olivia was asleep. The first few were almost nice. Janet saying we should talk. She didn't want this to get ugly. Family should work things out privately. By voicemail 7, her tone changed. She said I was being unreasonable and stubborn. Didn't I understand Rachel's pain? Couldn't I be compassionate? By voicemail 15, she was nearly screaming. I was destroying the family by refusing to share Olivia. Brian would be ashamed of my selfishness. I was keeping a grandmother from her grandchild, and that was cruel. The last 2 voicemails were just her crying and saying she didn't understand why I was doing this. I saved all of them and forwarded them to Harvey. He said they were perfect evidence of harassment. 3 days after that, Harvey called to tell me Rachel's lawyer had responded with a formal petition for grandparent visitation rights. The petition cited Janet's established relationship with Olivia and her right to maintain family connections. Harvey read me parts of it over the phone. It made me sound like I was isolating Olivia from her father's family out of spite. It claimed Janet had been a devoted grandmother since Olivia's birth, and I'd suddenly cut off all contact without reason. That was completely false. Janet had visited maybe 4 times in 8 weeks, always with Rachel, always pushing their agenda. Harvey said this was an intimidation tactic. The petition had no real legal standing since Janet barely knew Olivia, but it was designed to scare me into backing down. He told me not to worry. We had documentation proving Janet's minimal involvement and her harassment. That same evening, I logged into Brian's email account. I still had the password from when he was alive, and we shared everything. I hadn't looked at it since the funeral because seeing his name in the inbox made me feel like someone was sitting on my chest. But I needed to know what Rachel had really said to him. I searched for her name and found dozens of messages. Starting 7 months ago, right after I told the family I was pregnant, Rachel had been messaging Brian constantly. She asked about our plans for childcare, whether we'd thought about guardians, if we'd made a will. Brian's responses were polite but short. He thanked her for thinking of us but said we were handling it. Rachel kept pushing. She sent long emails about her and Todd's financial stability, their experience with kids through volunteering, their big house with a spare room perfect for a nursery. Brian never agreed to anything. His longest response was 3 sentences saying they'd think about guardianship options, but nothing was decided. Rachel sent 43 messages over 6 months. Brian sent 7 brief replies. None of them said what Rachel claimed. I screenshot everything and sent it to Harvey. He called me 20 minutes later sounding excited. This was exactly what we needed. It proved the guardianship conversation was Rachel's obsession, not Brian's plan. Harvey filed a motion to subpoena Brian's phone records and email history. He wanted the court to see the full picture of Rachel's pushing and Brian's lack of real agreement. The records came back a week later showing the same pattern. Rachel texting and calling constantly, Brian responding minimally. It was clear to anyone reading that Brian was being polite to his sister, but not actually planning to make her Olivia's guardian. On a Tuesday morning, I was feeding Olivia in the living room when someone knocked hard on the front door. I looked through the window and saw Janet standing on my porch. My heart started racing. I stayed quiet, hoping she'd leave. She knocked again, harder. Then she called through the door that she knew I was home because my car was in the driveway. She said she had a right to see her granddaughter. I walked to the door but didn't open it. I told her through the wood that all contact had to go through my lawyer now. She couldn't just show up at my house. Janet's voice got loud. She said I was poisoning Olivia against her family. I was keeping a baby from her grandmother out of pure spite. She started crying and saying she just wanted to hold Olivia once. Was that too much to ask? I repeated that she needed to leave and contact Harvey if she wanted to discuss anything. Janet screamed that I was a horrible person. Brian would hate what I was doing. She pounded on the door 3 more times and then I heard her walk away. I called Harvey immediately and told him what happened. He said to document the date and time and write down exactly what she said. This was more evidence of harassment. 3 days later, someone knocked on my door again. This time it was a woman I didn't know holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as a social worker and said someone had filed a complaint about my fitness as a mother. She looked apologetic and said she was sorry, but she had to investigate. The complaint claimed I was depressed, isolated, and unable to care for an infant properly. My hands went cold. I invited her in because I had nothing to hide. She looked around at my clean living room, Olivia's organized play area, the kitchen with clean bottles drying by the sink. She asked to see Olivia's room. I showed her the nursery with the crib and changing table and shelves of clean clothes. She asked about my support system, and I told her about Kira, my coworkers, the grief counseling I'd started. She made notes and asked to see Olivia. I brought her out, and the social worker watched me change her diaper and talk to her. Olivia was alert and happy, grabbing at my fingers. The social worker's face softened. She said off the record that she saw complaints like this all the time in custody disputes. My situation looked completely fine. Olivia was clearly healthy and well cared for. She'd have to file a report, but I shouldn't worry. She could see this was a malicious complaint meant to harass me. After she left, I sat on the couch holding Olivia and shaking. They'd actually called social services on me. Tried to get my baby taken away using lies about my mental state. I called Harvey and told him. He said this was good in a twisted way. It showed how desperate they were and how far they'd go. The social worker's report clearing me would be powerful evidence in court. But sitting there with my daughter sleeping against my chest, I felt more scared than I'd ever been in my life. Kira called the next morning and told me she found a grief support group for young widows that met Tuesday nights at a community center 20 minutes away. I didn't want to go. The idea of sitting in a circle talking about Brian with strangers made my stomach hurt. But Kira said she'd watch Olivia and I needed to get out of the house. Tuesday came and I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside the community center for 10 minutes before walking in. 7 women sat in chairs arranged in a circle. The facilitator smiled and introduced herself and asked me to share if I felt comfortable. I said my name and that my husband died 3 months ago in a motorcycle accident, and I had a 3-month-old baby. One woman started crying. She lost her husband in a car crash when her son was 6 months old. Another woman's husband had a heart attack at 32. They all had young kids. They all understood the impossible combination of grief and diapers and sleepless nights. Nobody told me I was lucky to have Olivia, or that time heals everything, or that Brian was in a better place. They just nodded and said it was hard, and they were sorry. I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not quiet crying, but the kind that makes your whole body shake. When I left 2 hours later, I felt lighter somehow. Like maybe I could do this. The next day, Rachel's email arrived. The subject line said, "Please read." I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. She wrote about her first miscarriage at 12 weeks, the second at 8 weeks, the third that required surgery, the fourth that happened the day before her 40th birthday. She described every IVF cycle, the hormone shots that made her sick, the waiting rooms full of pregnant women, the negative pregnancy tests, the embryos that didn't take, the ones that did, but didn't survive. She wrote about decorating the nursery after the first positive test and having to pack everything away after the miscarriage. About holding her friends' babies and feeling like her arms were empty. About watching me pregnant with Olivia and feeling jealous and ashamed of feeling jealous. The email ended with, "You have no idea what it's like to want something this badly and watch someone else have it so easily." I sat at my kitchen table reading it 3 times. I did feel bad for her. The pain in every sentence was real. But feeling bad for someone doesn't mean giving them your child. I closed my laptop without responding. Harvey called that afternoon. The social worker's report came back and it cleared me completely. She noted a clean home, healthy baby, appropriate care, and strong support system. She specifically mentioned that the complaint appeared motivated by custody dispute rather than genuine concern. Harvey filed the report with the court immediately. He also filed a motion to dismiss Janet's grandparent rights petition based on my fitness as a parent and Janet's lack of any established relationship with Olivia. He sounded pleased. This was exactly what we needed. 2 days later, a number I didn't recognize called while I was feeding Olivia. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice said my name and asked if I remembered him. He worked with Brian at the insurance company. They shared an office for 2 years. I remembered meeting him at the Christmas party once. He said he heard through mutual friends about the legal situation with Brian's family. He wanted me to know something about the guardianship conversation Rachel kept mentioning. Brian had talked to him about it at work. Rachel had been texting him constantly during my pregnancy, asking about guardianship arrangements. Brian felt uncomfortable with how pushy she was being, but didn't want to cause family drama by saying no directly. He told the coworker he had no intention of making Rachel Olivia's guardian, but didn't know how to tell her without Rachel and Janet getting upset. The coworker said Brian seemed stressed about it. He kept trying to change the subject when Rachel brought it up, but she wouldn't let it go. I thanked him and asked if he'd be willing to put that in writing. He said yes immediately. He liked Brian and thought what Rachel and Janet were doing was wrong. Harvey received the written statement 3 days later. It laid out the timeline of Rachel's requests and Brian's discomfort. It explained that Brian was trying to be kind to his sister while having no real intention of making her Olivia's guardian. The statement made it clear the guardianship texts Rachel showed me were her pushing an agenda, not Brian expressing his wishes. Harvey added it to our evidence file. That same week, Brian's aunt called. She was Janet's younger sister and had always been nice to me at family gatherings. She said she needed to tell me something about Janet's behavior. Janet had been obsessed with fixing Rachel's infertility for years. Every family event became about Rachel's latest treatment or another failed attempt. Janet convinced Rachel that adopting within the family was the perfect solution months before Brian died. The aunt said she heard them discussing it at a family gathering when I was 7 months pregnant. They talked about how young I was and how overwhelmed I'd be as a new mother. How Brian's job didn't pay that well and we lived in a small house. How Rachel and Todd could provide so much more. The aunt said she thought it was just talk at the time. Wishful thinking from a desperate woman and her enabling mother. She never imagined they'd actually try to take my baby. But after Brian's accident, they saw an opportunity. I felt sick listening to her. They planned this before Brian died. They were just waiting for a chance. The aunt confirmed they discussed it while I was still pregnant. They talked about me like I was a problem to solve. Like Olivia was already theirs and they just had to wait for the right moment. I thanked the aunt for telling me and hung up shaking. Harvey called the next morning after I emailed him what the aunt told me. He said this changed everything. It proved Janet and Rachel's petition wasn't about Olivia's welfare. It was about a pre-existing plan to acquire a baby for Rachel. He filed a motion with the judge explaining the new information and arguing the petition should be expedited given the harassment I was experiencing. The judge agreed to move up the hearing date. Instead of waiting 2 months, we'd go to court in 3 weeks. Harvey said the judge's willingness to expedite suggested she saw problems with their case. That same day, Rachel posted on social media. She didn't name me, but it was obvious. She wrote about the pain of infertility and being kept from family by people who don't understand. About watching from a distance while her brother's child grows up without knowing her aunt. About systems that favor biology over love. The comments filled with sympathy. Friends told her to stay strong. Several people asked what happened. I saw screenshots forwarded by mutual friends asking if this was about me. I felt humiliated seeing my private situation discussed publicly. But Harvey said not to respond. He said Rachel's posts actually helped our case by showing her manipulation tactics and poor judgment. He screenshot everything for evidence. The next day, 3 of Brian's cousins called me. First was his cousin from college who I'd met at the wedding. She said she heard what Janet and Rachel were doing and thought it was wrong. She offered to write a statement about how controlling Janet had always been with Brian growing up. Then Brian's cousin from his mom's side called. He said Rachel had been talking about wanting a baby at every family event for years, and it got uncomfortable. He'd testify about her behavior if I needed him to. The third cousin was someone I barely knew, but she said she had to reach out. She told me Janet pushed Rachel into this and convinced her it was reasonable. All 3 said they'd go to court and tell the judge what they saw. I thanked them and forwarded their information to Harvey. Having family support felt strange after weeks of feeling completely alone against Brian's whole family. Harvey added their names to our witness list that afternoon. 2 days later, Todd texted me asking to meet in person. No lawyers, no Rachel, just us. I stared at the message for 20 minutes. Harvey told me not to do it when I called him. He said anything Todd wanted to say could go through lawyers. But I was curious what he'd say without Rachel there. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop across town the next morning. I arranged for my neighbor to watch Olivia and drove there early. Todd was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived. He looked tired. Dark circles under his eyes and his shirt wrinkled like he slept in it. I sat down across from him and waited. He started talking immediately. He said this whole thing had gone too far and he was sorry. He said he couldn't control Rachel's desperation anymore. She wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, just obsessing over Olivia constantly. He said Janet kept pushing Rachel and telling her this was her last chance at motherhood. I listened without saying anything. Then he made his offer. He'd convince them to drop the petition if I agreed to regular supervised visits. Maybe once a month at his house with him present. I shook my head before he finished. I told him I wouldn't reward their behavior with access to my daughter. He said he understood but asked me to think about it. I stood up to leave. He grabbed my arm gently and said Rachel needed help he couldn't give her. I pulled away and walked out. Rachel found out about the meeting that same day. Todd must have told her or she saw it on his phone. She called Harvey's office screaming that Todd betrayed her by meeting with me. Harvey's assistant heard her threatening to file new motions. The next morning, Harvey called me. Rachel's lawyer filed an emergency motion claiming I was unstable. The motion said I was putting Olivia at risk by refusing family support during my grief. It said I was isolated and paranoid and needed immediate intervention. Harvey said we had to go to court in 3 days for an emergency hearing. I felt sick reading the motion. They were using my grief as a weapon again. Harvey told me to stay calm and let him handle it. He said he'd bring all our documentation and the judge would see through their claims, but I had to be ready to testify and answer questions about my mental state. The hearing happened on a Wednesday morning. I barely slept the night before because Olivia was up every 2 hours. I wore the same black dress from Brian's funeral because it was the only professional thing I owned that still fit. Harvey met me outside the courthouse and went over what to expect. He said Rachel's lawyer would try to make me look unstable, but our evidence was strong. We walked into the courtroom and I saw Rachel sitting with Janet and her lawyer. Rachel's eyes were red like she'd been crying. The judge came in and called the case. Rachel's lawyer went first. He talked about how I was a young widow with no family support, refusing help from loving relatives. He said I'd cut off all contact with Brian's family and was isolating Olivia from her grandmother. He made it sound like I was the problem. Then Harvey presented our evidence. He showed the judge my pediatrician's letter about Olivia's health. He showed the social worker's report clearing me. He showed the texts proving Rachel pushed the guardianship idea on Brian. The judge looked through everything carefully. She asked Rachel's lawyer why they filed an emergency motion when the child was clearly thriving. He said my emotional state was the concern, not Olivia's current condition. Then I had to take the stand. Harvey asked me basic questions about my daily routine with Olivia. I explained my schedule, my support systems, my therapy appointments. Then Rachel's lawyer got to question me. He asked if I was emotionally stable enough to care for an infant alone. Something about the way he said it broke me. I started crying right there on the stand. I couldn't stop. All the grief I'd been holding back for weeks came out. The judge called a recess immediately. The bailiff brought me water and tissues. Harvey sat with me in the hallway while I tried to pull myself together. He said showing emotion wasn't weakness and the judge would understand. He said crying proved I was human and processing real grief, not unstable. After 15 minutes, we went back in. The judge denied the emergency motion. She said Rachel's lawyer wasted the court's time with baseless claims. She said the evidence showed I was a fit mother, and Olivia was well cared for. She said grief was normal after losing a spouse and didn't indicate instability. Then she set a date for the full grandparent rights hearing in 6 weeks. She warned both sides against further harassment and said any more emergency motions without merit would result in sanctions. Rachel started crying when the judge finished. Janet's face turned red, but she stayed quiet. Harvey and I left the courthouse quickly. In the parking lot, he told me this was a good outcome. The judge saw through their manipulation, and our case was stronger now. But I felt exhausted and empty. Fighting in court while grieving felt impossible. 3 days later, my supervisor called me into her office. She showed me a letter from Janet. The letter said I was neglecting my job because of personal issues. It suggested my employer should be concerned about my reliability. It mentioned the custody battle and implied I might not be stable enough to work with children. My supervisor looked uncomfortable. She asked if everything was okay at home. I explained the whole situation. I told her about Brian's death, about Janet and Rachel trying to take Olivia, about the court case. She listened and then put the letter in her desk drawer. She said she'd seen no issues with my work performance. She said she was sorry for what I was going through and asked if I needed any accommodations. I thanked her and left feeling relieved. Janet's attempt to sabotage my job failed completely. Harvey recommended I start therapy to help process everything. He gave me the name of someone who worked with grief and family conflict. Her name was Coral Jennings. I called her that afternoon and got an appointment for the next week. When I met Coral, she was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s. Her office was small but comfortable with soft lighting and plants everywhere. I told her everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said what Janet and Rachel did was using my vulnerability against me. She said protecting Olivia wasn't selfish. It was healthy boundaries. She said grief made people easy targets for manipulation, and I'd done the right thing by fighting back. We talked about how betrayal from family hurt worse than from strangers. She gave me strategies for managing anxiety when court dates approached. I left feeling like someone finally understood. A week later, Harvey called with new information. He'd been digging into Rachel and Todd's legal history. He found out they consulted with 3 different lawyers before finding one willing to take their case. 2 of those lawyers told them their petition had no merit. One lawyer's notes said the case was weak and likely motivated by grief, rather than genuine concern for the child. Harvey said this proved Rachel and Todd knew their case was bad, but pursued it anyway. He filed the information with the court as evidence of bad faith. The judge would see they shopped around for a lawyer who'd take a weak case. This made their whole petition look even worse. Harvey said it strengthened our position significantly for the full hearing in 5 weeks. 2 days later, Brian's best friend called me. He said he heard about the court case through mutual friends and wanted to help. We met for coffee while my neighbor watched Olivia. He told me about conversations he had with Brian after Olivia was born. Brian talked about how proud he was of me as a mother. He said Brian never mentioned worries about me raising Olivia alone. When Rachel brought up the guardianship thing, Brian told him she was being pushy, and he didn't know how to shut it down without causing family drama. He said Brian called Rachel's requests awkward and uncomfortable. I asked if he'd testify, and he agreed immediately. He said Brian would want someone protecting his family from this mess. I called Harvey from the parking lot and told him. Harvey said this testimony would directly challenge Rachel's claims about Brian's wishes. He scheduled a meeting to prepare the friend's statement. At the next grief support group meeting, I broke down talking about the legal battle. 2 women pulled me aside after. One dealt with her husband's parents trying to take her kids 3 years ago. The other had her sister-in-law claim she was too depressed to parent. They both won their cases, but it took months of fighting. They gave me advice about documenting everything and keeping copies of all communications. They told me to screenshot any social media posts from Janet or Rachel. They said judges see through manipulation when you have evidence. One woman said her therapist taught her a phrase that helped during court stress. She said to tell myself I'm protecting my child, not punishing my in-laws. That reframe helped me sleep better. The other woman offered to watch Olivia if I needed backup childcare during court dates. Having people who understood made the isolation hurt less. 3 days before the scheduled mediation, Janet showed up at my door. I saw her through the window carrying a cardboard box. She knocked and called my name. I opened the door but kept the screen locked. She held up the box and said it contained Brian's childhood photos and baby clothes. She said she wanted me to have them for Olivia. Then she said she'd been thinking about everything and maybe we could find a compromise. She said if I reconsidered letting Rachel be part of Olivia's life, she'd give me all of Brian's mementos. She said Rachel just wanted to be an aunt, nothing crazy. I told her to leave the box on the porch. She asked if we could talk inside. I said no and closed the door. She stood there for 5 minutes knocking. I called Harvey and he said to document it as harassment. I took photos of her through the window. She finally left the box and drove away. I brought the box inside an hour later. Looking through Brian's baby pictures made me cry, but I was glad to have them for Olivia. That same week, my friend sent me screenshots of Rachel's Facebook posts. She was posting vague things about corrupt systems and children being kept from loving homes. She wrote about how money and lawyers can silence truth. She posted articles about grandparent rights and family court bias. Her friends started commenting, asking if she was okay. Some comments said her posts seemed concerning. One friend asked directly if she needed to talk to someone. Todd's sister commented telling her to call. The posts got more intense over 3 days. Then suddenly they all disappeared. My friend said Todd must have convinced her to delete them. Harvey said to save all the screenshots because they showed Rachel's state of mind. He said the posts demonstrated obsession rather than genuine concern for a child's welfare. A mediator named Emmett Jennings called both lawyers suggesting mediation before the court hearing. Harvey told me it was my choice, but he thought it was pointless. He said Janet and Rachel showed no signs of backing down. I decided to try anyway. I thought maybe sitting in a room together would help them see reason. Harvey said to keep my expectations low. The mediation was scheduled for the following week at a neutral office building downtown. The mediation session lasted 2 hours and went nowhere. Emmett explained the process and asked each side to state their position. Janet and Rachel wanted regular unsupervised visits starting immediately. They said once a week at minimum, building to overnight stays. They acted like this was reasonable. I said I'd consider supervised visits only after they completed therapy and apologized for their behavior. Rachel started crying and said I was being cruel. Janet said my conditions were punishment, not protection. Emmett asked what kind of relationship I envisioned long-term. I said I didn't know because they destroyed my trust. Rachel said she just wanted to be part of Olivia's life. I said showing up at my house demanding my baby wasn't how aunts behaved. Janet accused me of using Olivia as a weapon. I said they did that first by filing for grandparent rights. Emmett tried different approaches for an hour, but we couldn't find common ground. He finally said the gap between our positions was too wide for mediation. He recommended we proceed to the hearing and let the judge decide. During one exchange, Rachel admitted something that caught me off guard. Emmett asked about her support systems and coping strategies. Rachel said she'd been in therapy for infertility grief. Then she said she stopped going 6 months ago. Janet looked uncomfortable. Emmett asked why she stopped. Rachel said her therapist suggested she was becoming obsessed with having a baby. She said the therapist didn't understand her situation. She said the therapist wanted her to accept childlessness, but she couldn't do that. Emmett asked if she'd consider resuming therapy. Rachel said she didn't need therapy. She needed a child. Janet jumped in and changed the subject. But I understood something important in that moment. Rachel's pain was real, but it had turned into something unhealthy. She needed help I couldn't provide by giving her access to Olivia. Her admission confirmed that protecting my daughter from this obsession was the right choice, even though it felt cruel. After the failed mediation, Harvey scheduled multiple meetings to prepare our case. He organized testimony from Brian's coworker about the guardianship context. He got a statement from Brian's best friend about Brian's confidence in my parenting. 3 of Brian's cousins agreed to testify about Janet's controlling behavior and Rachel's escalating baby obsession. My pediatrician prepared detailed records of Olivia's health and development. Coral wrote a letter about my mental health and coping strategies. The social worker's report cleared me completely. Harvey laid everything out on his conference table. He said the evidence of my fitness was overwhelming. He said the evidence of Janet and Rachel's manipulation was clear and documented. He walked me through what to expect at the hearing. He practiced questions the other lawyer might ask. He told me to stay calm and honest. He said the facts were on our side. The week before the hearing, I had a crisis of confidence. I couldn't sleep wondering if I was depriving Olivia of family connections. I called Coral and got an emergency session. I told her I kept thinking about Rachel's pain and Janet's grief over losing Brian. I said maybe I was being selfish by cutting them off completely. Coral asked me to describe how Janet and Rachel treated me during the worst time of my life. I walked through the whole thing again. The ambush 2 weeks after Brian's funeral. The threats about insurance bills. The social worker complaint. The harassment. Coral asked if those were the actions of people who cared about my well-being. She said people who view a child as a possession rather than a person don't make safe family connections. She reminded me that protecting Olivia from manipulation wasn't punishment. She said healthy family relationships don't require court battles and restraining orders. She asked what I wanted Olivia to learn about boundaries and self-protection. I realized I wanted to teach her that love doesn't demand self-sacrifice. I left her office feeling clear about my choice again. At the hearing, Janet's sister took the stand and everything shifted. Harvey called her as a witness and Janet looked shocked. The sister said her name and confirmed she was Janet's younger sister and Brian's aunt. Harvey asked about her relationship with Janet. She described growing up with a controlling older sister who always needed things her way. She talked about Janet's history of manipulating family situations. Then Harvey asked about Rachel. The sister said Janet had been obsessed with fixing Rachel's infertility for years. She said Janet talked constantly about how unfair it was that Rachel couldn't have children. She testified that at a family gathering while I was pregnant, she overheard Janet and Rachel discussing plans. They talked about how young and overwhelmed I'd be as a new mother. They discussed how I'd need help and support. Rachel said it would be natural for her to step in as the experienced aunt even though she had no children. Janet said if anything happened to Brian, Rachel would be the obvious choice to raise Olivia. The sister said she was horrified but thought it was just talk. She didn't realize they'd actually try it. She said when she heard about the custody case, she knew she had to speak up. Janet's face turned red during the testimony. Rachel started crying. The judge asked several follow-up questions. The sister's testimony as a family member carried weight because she had no reason to lie. She was risking her relationship with Janet to tell the truth. Rachel's lawyer called her next, and she walked to the witness stand with shaking hands. She sat down and twisted a tissue between her fingers while her lawyer asked about her marriage to Todd and their attempts to have children. Rachel described 15 years of trying, the hope each month that never came, 4 miscarriages that left her empty and broken. She talked about the fertility treatments, the hormones that made her feel crazy, the procedures that hurt and failed anyway. She cried when she described holding other people's babies at family events and going home to an empty nursery. I felt bad for her pain because it was real and terrible. But then her lawyer asked what she could offer Olivia, and Rachel's face changed. She sat up straighter and listed everything like she was applying for a job. The big house with a yard and a pool. The college fund already started. The private school Todd's company had connections with. The stable 2-parent home where Olivia would have everything she needed. She said she'd been preparing to be a mother for 15 years while I'd only had 9 months. She said she knew more about child development from all her research than most mothers learned in a lifetime. The judge started frowning and asked Rachel directly if she understood that Olivia already had a mother. Rachel said yes, but that circumstances weren't ideal for a child. The judge asked what circumstances she meant. Rachel said a grieving widow working part-time with no family support wasn't the best environment for a baby. The judge asked if Rachel thought grief made someone unfit to parent. Rachel backtracked and said no, but that it was a lot for one person to handle alone. The judge thanked her and she went back to her seat looking pleased with herself like she'd done well. Harvey squeezed my hand under the table. Then the judge called me to testify. I walked up there feeling like everyone was staring at me and judging whether I was good enough to keep my own baby. Harvey had practiced questions with me, but my mouth felt dry anyway. Rachel's lawyer went first and asked about my work schedule and my income and whether I had family nearby to help. I answered honestly that I worked part-time as a teacher's aide, that money was tight but manageable, that my family lived across the country. He asked about my emotional state and whether I was seeing a therapist. I said yes, I was grieving my husband, and yes, I had a therapist who was helping me process everything. He asked if I thought it was fair to raise Olivia in grief when she could live in a happy, stable home. I said grief was part of life, and I wouldn't hide it from my daughter, but I also had joy with her every day. He asked if I could really give Olivia everything she needed alone. I said I wasn't alone because I had friends and support groups and Brian's cousins who loved us. Then Harvey asked me questions and I felt calmer. He asked about my relationship with Olivia, and I talked about nursing her and rocking her to sleep and watching her discover her hands. I described our morning routine and how she smiled when she heard my voice. I explained the support systems I'd built through the grief group and my therapist and the pediatrician who saw us regularly. Harvey asked about Rachel and Janet's behavior, and I walked through everything calmly. The ambush 2 weeks after Brian's funeral, the threats about insurance bills, the social worker complaint, the constant pressure and manipulation. I said I understood Rachel's pain, but that didn't give her the right to my daughter. I said maybe someday when Olivia was older and Rachel had gotten help, we could have some kind of relationship, but right now their behavior made that impossible. The judge asked me a few questions about my plans for Olivia's future, and I answered honestly that I planned to raise her with love and the truth about her father and connections to family who cared about her well-being, not their own needs. Then I went back to my seat and Harvey whispered that I did great. The judge said she'd take a short break to review everything and left the courtroom. Janet and Rachel huddled with their lawyer looking confident. Todd sat separate from them, staring at his hands. Harvey told me the judge's questions were good signs, but not to get my hopes up yet. We sat there for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Then the judge came back and everyone stood up. She sat down and looked at papers in front of her before speaking. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence and testimony carefully. She said that grandparent rights existed to protect established relationships between grandparents and grandchildren when parents tried to cut off those relationships without cause. She said Janet had no established relationship with Olivia to protect, since the baby was only a few months old, and Janet had barely visited. She said the evidence showed that my decision to limit contact wasn't arbitrary, but based on Janet and Rachel's concerning behavior and poor judgment regarding the child's best interests. She said their attempt to pressure a grieving widow into giving up her infant showed they viewed the child as an object to acquire rather than a person with her own needs and rights. She denied the petition completely. Rachel started crying immediately. Janet's face turned red and angry. Todd closed his eyes and let out a breath. I felt Harvey's hand on my shoulder. The judge wasn't done. She said that based on the harassment documented in the case, she was issuing a restraining order preventing Janet and Rachel from contacting me directly or coming to my home. All future communication had to go through lawyers. She said any relationship with Olivia in the future would have to be initiated by me voluntarily, when and if I decided it was appropriate. She said she hoped both parties would respect the court's decision and move forward in Olivia's best interests. Then she dismissed us. Rachel was sobbing into her hands while Janet sat stiff and furious beside her. Their lawyer gathered his papers quickly like he wanted to escape. Todd stood up and looked at me across the courtroom. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," but didn't try to come over. Harvey shook my hand and said the ruling was as clear as he'd hoped. He said they could technically appeal, but the judge's decision was so strong and their case so weak that an appeal probably wouldn't succeed. He told me to document anything if they violated the restraining order and contact him immediately. He said to go home and celebrate this victory. I walked out of the courthouse into cold air that felt clean and sharp. I drove home in a daze, the relief not quite real yet. When I got there, I picked Olivia up from her crib where the babysitter had put her down for a nap. I held her for a full hour, just breathing in her baby smell and feeling her weight against my chest. I cried, but this time from relief that the immediate threat was over. That night, the grief support group brought dinner to my house. They'd been following the case and knew what today meant. We sat around my small living room eating casserole and garlic bread while Olivia slept in her swing. They understood how much strength it took to fight while mourning. They knew I was exhausted and relieved and still sad all at once. A week later, Brian's cousins called and invited me to a family gathering at one of their houses. They made it very clear that Janet and Rachel wouldn't be there. I was nervous about family events after everything, but I went. It felt good to let Olivia meet relatives who loved her without any agenda or strings attached. They passed her around and took pictures and told stories about Brian as a kid. Nobody asked me for anything or suggested I couldn't handle being a single mom. They just welcomed us and made us feel like we belonged. I saw Coral the next week for my regular appointment. We talked about the complex feelings of winning the case but losing Brian's family in the process. I told her I kept thinking about Janet before all this, how she'd seemed kind at my wedding and excited about becoming a grandmother. Coral asked me to describe who Janet actually was, versus who I'd wanted her to be. I realized I'd been grieving people who never really existed. The loving mother-in-law and supportive sister-in-law I'd imagined were just masks they wore until they wanted something. Coral said that was another kind of loss to process. She said it was okay to grieve both the relationship I'd lost with Brian and the family relationships I'd thought I had. 2 months after the hearing, I got a letter from Todd through Harvey's office. It was short and formal. He said he and Rachel were divorcing and she was moving across the country for a fresh start. He said he was sorry for everything that happened. He asked if Rachel could send birthday cards to Olivia without expecting any response or contact. He said he understood if the answer was no. Harvey called and said it was completely my choice. I thought about it for a few days. I decided birthday cards were okay as long as there were no visits or phone calls or attempts at more contact. I figured maybe someday when Olivia was older and could decide for herself, she might want to know her aunt. But for now, cards in a box were all I could handle. My supervisor called me the week after the hearing to talk about coming back to work. She said she'd worked out a flexible schedule where I could bring Olivia to the office daycare 3 days a week for half days. The school district had a program for employees with infants, and the cost was something I could actually afford. I started back the following Monday, and it felt strange to put on work clothes and pack a diaper bag and drive somewhere that wasn't a lawyer's office or courthouse. The other teachers' aides welcomed me back with a small plant for my desk and careful questions about how I was doing. Nobody asked about the legal stuff directly, but one coworker whose sister went through a custody thing gave me a knowing look and squeezed my hand. Having adult conversations about lesson plans and student progress felt good in a way I hadn't expected. I ate lunch in the teacher's lounge and talked about normal things like the upcoming school play and whether the new math curriculum was working. My paycheck wasn't much, but it was mine, and I could pay my bills without touching Brian's life insurance money that I was saving for Olivia's future. 3 weeks into my return to work, the front desk called to say I had a package delivery. I went to the office and found a large box with no return address. The secretary handed it to me with a smile, and I took it back to my desk. Inside were baby clothes in sizes Olivia would wear over the next year, all expensive brands with tags still attached. Underneath was a card that said, "A grandmother's love cannot be restrained," in Janet's handwriting. My hands started shaking as I realized she'd sent this to my workplace where she knew I'd have to receive it in front of colleagues. I took photos of everything with my phone, documented the date and time, and called Harvey during my lunch break. He said this was a clear violation of the restraining order and he'd send a warning letter that day. Any further contact would result in contempt charges and possible jail time. I packed everything back in the box and gave it to Harvey's office that afternoon. My supervisor noticed I was upset and told me to take the rest of the day off, but I stayed because going home to an empty house felt worse than being around people. The grief support group met that Thursday, and we spent the session talking about upcoming holidays and difficult dates. Christmas was 8 weeks away, and it would be Olivia's first and my first without Brian. The anniversary of his death was in February, 6 months after the funeral. The group leader had us write down the dates we were dreading and then make plans for how to handle them. One woman whose husband died 2 years ago said the anticipation was always worse than the actual day. Another said she'd learned to create new traditions instead of trying to recreate old ones. I decided I'd spend Christmas morning just me and Olivia at home, then go to Brian's cousin's house in the afternoon where I knew I'd be welcome. For the death anniversary, I planned to take the day off work and maybe visit Brian's grave with Olivia, let myself feel sad without trying to push through it. Having people who understood that grief doesn't follow a schedule made these plans feel possible instead of overwhelming. They knew I might fall apart on random Tuesdays and be fine on the actual difficult dates. They knew that seeing other families with fathers would hurt sometimes, and that was okay. Brian's best friend started coming by every Sunday afternoon around the time Olivia usually woke up from her nap. He'd hold her and tell her stories about her dad, stuff from before I knew Brian. He told her about the time Brian tried to fix his motorcycle in the rain and ended up covered in mud. He told her about Brian's terrible singing voice and how he'd sing anyway. He brought photos I'd never seen of Brian as a teenager looking awkward and happy. I'd make coffee and sit on the couch listening to him talk to my daughter who was too young to understand, but who seemed to like his voice. He never tried to be a replacement father or suggested I needed a man around. He just showed up consistently and kept Brian's memory alive in a way that felt healthy instead of painful. Sometimes he'd stay for dinner and we'd order pizza and watch whatever game was on TV. He became part of our weekly routine in a way that felt natural, like family without any of the toxic strings attached. I opened a savings account for Olivia at my bank and set up automatic transfers of $50 every payday. It wasn't much, but it was money I would have spent on lawyers if the case had dragged on for months like Harvey originally thought it might. I'd put Brian's life insurance money in a separate account that I wasn't touching except for true emergencies. This new account was for Olivia's future, whatever that looked like. Maybe college or trade school or helping her start a business someday. I liked looking at the balance grow slowly and knowing I was planning ahead instead of just surviving day to day. The bank gave me a folder with information about education savings plans and investment options I could consider when the balance got bigger. I put the folder in my desk drawer where I kept important papers and felt like I was being a responsible parent in a way Janet and Rachel had insisted I couldn't be. 6 months after the hearing, I got a letter forwarded through Harvey's office from an adoption agency. It was a standard notification that Rachel and Todd had been accepted into their adoption program and were in the waiting period for a domestic infant adoption. The letter explained that as part of their application process, they'd disclosed the previous legal situation with me, and the agency wanted to confirm that there were no ongoing custody disputes or concerns. Harvey called to tell me the agency had reached out to him directly, and he'd provided a summary of the case and the restraining order. He said the agency seemed thorough and professional in their screening process. I felt a weird mix of relief and sadness reading that letter. Relief that Rachel was finding another path to motherhood that didn't involve trying to take my daughter. Sadness that it had come to all this, that she'd been so desperate she'd tried to steal a baby from a grieving widow instead of pursuing legitimate adoption sooner. I hoped she was getting therapy as part of the adoption process. I hoped she'd be a good mother to whatever child she eventually adopted. I hoped that child would be safe with her. My sessions with Coral shifted from processing immediate crisis to talking about longer-term stuff like trust and relationships. She asked me about friendships and whether I was isolating myself. I told her about the support group and Brian's best friend and his cousins who checked in regularly. She asked about dating, and I laughed because the idea of trusting someone new felt impossible. She said that was normal after what I'd been through, that Janet and Rachel had used my vulnerability against me in the worst possible way. We talked about how to accept help from people without waiting for the other shoe to drop, without assuming everyone wanted something from me. She said I'd need to learn to trust again eventually, not for romance necessarily, but just for basic human connection. I wasn't ready yet, but I could see her point. I was starting to let my guard down with coworkers and other parents at the daycare. I was learning that most people were just kind without expecting anything back. Olivia turned 6 months old on a Tuesday, and I took her to the pediatrician for her checkup. She'd doubled her birth weight and was sitting up on her own and grabbing at everything in reach. The doctor did all the developmental checks and said she was hitting every milestone right on schedule. She asked about our home situation, and I gave her the short version of the legal stuff being resolved. The doctor looked at Olivia and then at me and said something I hadn't expected. She said Olivia was clearly a securely attached baby despite everything that had happened in her short life. She said babies know when they're loved and safe, and Olivia showed all the signs of a child who trusted her caregiver completely. I cried in the exam room, and the doctor handed me tissues and said I was doing a great job. She said single parents often worry they're not enough, but Olivia was thriving. She was sleeping better now, going 6 or 7 hours at night before waking up hungry. She smiled at familiar faces and cried when strangers held her. She was becoming her own little person with preferences and personality. I sat down one evening after Olivia went to sleep and wrote a letter to Brian on my laptop. I told him everything that had happened with his mother and sister. I explained the legal battle and the restraining order and why I'd had to cut off his family. I wrote about the choices I'd made to protect our daughter and how hard it had been to do it alone. I told him about the support I'd found and the people who'd helped us. I wrote about my hope that someday when Olivia was old enough to ask questions, I could show her this letter and she'd understand. I wanted her to know the full truth with compassion for everyone's pain, including Rachel's infertility grief and Janet's misguided attempts to fix her daughter's problems. I wanted Olivia to know that I'd never kept her from her father's family out of spite, but because their actions had made it necessary. I saved the letter in a folder labeled For Olivia, along with photos of Brian and copies of cards he'd sent me during our relationship. Someday she'd want to know her father and her history, and I'd give her everything I had. Brian's aunt kept calling every week or two to check on us, and eventually started coming by for visits. She brought Olivia little gifts and held her while I did dishes or folded laundry. She told me stories about Janet's patterns over the years, how she'd always tried to control everything and everyone around her. She said Janet had pushed Rachel into endless fertility treatments even when Rachel wanted to stop. She said Todd had told family members he felt like he couldn't say no to Janet's pressure. The aunt helped me understand that what happened wasn't really about me personally. Janet would have tried to control and manipulate whoever Brian married because that's what she did. Rachel's desperation had given Janet an opening, but the controlling behavior was lifelong. The aunt became a grandmother figure for Olivia, someone who loved her without agenda, and who connected her to Brian's family history in a healthy way. She brought old family photos and told Olivia about her great-grandparents and the family she came from. She made it clear that Olivia had family who cared about her, even if her grandmother and aunt couldn't be part of her life right now. At the next grief support group meeting, the women cheered when I told them Olivia slept 7 hours straight the night before. One of them brought cupcakes to celebrate what she called my first real victory in months. Another woman shared that she'd laughed at a joke her coworker told without feeling guilty afterward, and we all understood how big that moment was. The group leader reminded us that healing doesn't happen in a straight line. Some days I still woke up reaching for Brian's side of the bed. Some days I cried while folding his old t-shirts that still sat in the dresser. But other days I made it through without breaking down, and those days were becoming more common. The women nodded and shared their own experiences of grief coexisting with small moments of joy. They got it in a way nobody else could. I started going to work 3 days a week instead of 2. My supervisor let me bring Olivia to the office sometimes when daycare fell through, and my coworkers took turns holding her during their breaks. I saw Coral every Thursday afternoon and brought Olivia along because she said babies were welcome. The sessions helped me process everything that happened with Janet and Rachel without letting anger consume me. Brian's aunt visited every Sunday and brought lunch so I didn't have to cook. She told Olivia stories about her daddy while I ate and actually tasted the food for the first time in months. 4 months after the court hearing, I realized one morning that I'd stopped thinking about the legal battle constantly. It felt like something that happened to someone else in a different lifetime. I had a routine now that included work and therapy and support group and healthy family time with people who actually cared about us. Olivia was 6 months old and sitting up on her own, grabbing at everything within reach and babbling in her own language. I took her to the park and watched other parents with their kids and didn't feel the crushing loneliness I'd felt before. I had my own community now, built from people I chose rather than people I was stuck with. I checked my email one Tuesday morning and saw Todd's name in my inbox. My stomach clenched, but I opened it anyway. The message was short and formal. He wrote that he and Rachel were getting divorced and she was moving to Oregon for a fresh start. He apologized again for everything that happened and said he hoped Olivia and I were doing well. He asked me not to respond and said this was just to let me know we wouldn't hear from them again. I stared at the email for a long time, feeling a weird mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the threat was truly over. Sadness for Rachel's pain even after everything she'd done. I forwarded the email to Harvey just in case, then deleted it and went back to making Olivia's breakfast. That evening I sat on the floor with Olivia while she played with her blocks. She knocked them over and laughed, then looked at me to see if I was watching. I was always watching. Brian's aunt called to check in, and I told her about Todd's email. She said she'd heard through family that Rachel's therapist had finally convinced her she needed intensive treatment for her grief and obsession. The aunt hoped Rachel would find peace somewhere far away from us. I hoped so too, but mostly I just felt grateful we were safe. I looked around my living room at the photos on the walls and the toys scattered on the floor, and Olivia's swing in the corner. This was our home, our life, built on our own terms. Losing Janet and Rachel had been painful but necessary. Some family relationships are too broken to fix no matter how much you want to. We were building something better now. A chosen family made of people who loved us without conditions or hidden agendas. Olivia was growing up surrounded by genuine care instead of manipulation dressed up as love. I slept through most nights now without nightmares or panic attacks. When I looked at my daughter, I saw hope blooming where grief used to live. The pain of losing Brian would never disappear completely, but it was making room for other feelings now. Joy when Olivia smiled, gratitude for the support system we'd built, pride in how far we'd come. I was doing this, raising her alone but not really alone at all.